For generations of television viewers, Henry Winkler has represented something almost impossible to forget. The leather jacket, the confident smile, the unmistakable mannerisms, and above all, Arthur Fonzie Fonzarelli, the character who transformed Winkler from a struggling young actor into one of the most recognizable faces on American television. But there is another Henry Winkler that the public did not see. Behind the confidence of Fonzie was a young man who spent much of his childhood believing that something was wrong with him. Behind the television star was someone who struggled to read, struggled in school, and spent years wondering why tasks that seemed easy for everyone else could feel almost impossible to him. And now, at 80 years old, the most heartbreaking part of Henry Winkler's story may not be something that recently happened to him. It may be the realization of just how many years he spent believing that he was not good enough when, in reality, his brain was simply working differently. That truth took decades to fully understand. Henry Winkler was born in New York City in 1945 to parents who had escaped Nazi Germany. His family had survived an extraordinarily frightening period in European history, and his parents placed enormous importance on education, discipline, and achievement. But young Henry struggled academically. He wanted to succeed. He wanted to understand what he was reading. He wanted to perform well in school. Yet the harder he tried, the more frustrated he became. According to Yale's dyslexia program, Winkler has described being called lazy and stupid as a child and being told that he was not living up to his potential. He has also explained that he was repeatedly punished and grounded because his parents believed that discipline would solve what they thought was a lack of effort. But effort was never the real problem. Winkler was dyslexic. He simply did not know it yet. Imagine being a child who studies a word over and over again, knows it perfectly the night before a test, and then walks into the classroom the next morning and suddenly cannot remember how to spell it. Imagine working harder than everyone around you and still feeling like you are falling behind. That was Henry Winkler's reality. He later described the experience as painful because he knew he was trying. He knew he wanted to succeed. Yet his brain did not process reading and written language in the same way as the people around him. And perhaps the saddest part was that he had no explanation for it. There was no diagnosis waiting for him. There was no teacher saying, "Henry, you learned differently." Instead, he grew up hearing messages that made him question his intelligence. Still, there was one place where Henry felt different in a positive way. That place was acting. When he performed, something changed. The boy who struggled with school could suddenly connect with people. He could make them laugh. He could express emotions. He could become someone else. Acting did not require him to prove himself in exactly the same way that a classroom did. It gave him a language he understood. But becoming a professional actor was hardly an easy escape. Winkler attended Emerson College and eventually earned an MFA from the Yale School of Drama in 1970. Even there, his learning difficulties remained. Reading scripts and memorizing lines were difficult tasks, but he developed his own strategies. He would study material repeatedly. He would memorize what he could. And when he couldn't remember something, he learned to improvise. That improvisational ability would eventually become one of the tools that helped save his career. Because after Yale came something every young actor fears: rejection. Winkler auditioned again and again. He searched for work. He took smaller opportunities. He struggled to establish himself. And then came the role that changed his life. Arthur Fonzarelli, the Fonz. At first, Fonzie was not intended to become the cultural phenomenon he eventually became. But Winkler brought something special to the character. He gave Fonzie confidence, humor, warmth, and an unmistakable presence. The character became a sensation. Suddenly, the actor who had spent years questioning whether he was good enough was being watched by millions. The world saw a man who appeared completely confident. But Henry Winkler knew the truth. The confidence belonged to Fonzie. Henry was still Henry. According to Yale's account of his experience, Winkler struggled with reading scripts even while working on Happy Days. He could spend enormous amounts of time preparing his lines and still find himself unable to retrieve them when the cameras were rolling. That contrast is one of the most remarkable parts of his story. Millions of people saw Fonzie as effortlessly cool. Meanwhile, the actor playing him was working extraordinarily hard simply to get through the words on the page. And this is where the story becomes heartbreaking. Success did not immediately heal the wounds created during childhood. Fame did not erase years of being told he was lazy. Awards did not automatically give him confidence. Millions of fans could love Henry Winkler, while a small voice inside him continued asking whether he was actually good enough. The world had one image of him. He had another image of himself. Those two versions of Henry Winkler spent years fighting for control. Then, when Winkler was 31, something happened that changed the way he understood his entire childhood. His stepson, Jed, was struggling with schoolwork. Winkler recognized the behavior because it reminded him of himself. Jed was tested. He was diagnosed with dyslexia. And suddenly, Winkler had an explanation for his own past. He realized that the problem he had carried for years had a name: dyslexia. It was a revelation, but it was not necessarily a simple or happy one. Because understanding the reason for his struggles also meant looking back at the years of punishment and criticism. It meant wondering what his childhood might have been like if someone had understood him earlier. What if a teacher had recognized the signs? What if his parents had known? What if someone had told him that he was not stupid? What if he had grown up understanding that his brain simply worked differently? Those questions cannot change the past. And that may be one of the most painful realities in Henry Winkler's story. But instead of allowing that pain to define him, Winkler eventually transformed it into something useful. He began talking openly about dyslexia. He became an advocate for children who struggle with learning. And he co-created the Hank Zipser children's book series, a character whose experiences were inspired in part by Winkler's own childhood. The books gave children something Winkler himself had desperately needed when he was young: someone who understood them, someone who could say, in effect, "You are not broken." That message became larger than acting. It became part of Henry Winkler's legacy. But there was another painful chapter waiting for him: the end of Happy Days. For most actors, becoming famous is the dream. For Winkler, becoming famous as Fonzie eventually created a different problem. The character became so iconic that audiences and Hollywood executives could have difficulty seeing the actor behind him. Winkler later spoke about the emotional pain he experienced after Happy Days ended. He had spent years playing one of the most recognizable characters on television, and suddenly he had to convince the industry that he could be someone else. The irony was almost cruel. When he was unknown, he could not get enough opportunities. When he became famous, the success of one role threatened to prevent him from getting others. He was no longer fighting to become famous. He was fighting to become Henry Winkler again. That period could have ended differently. Some actors might have walked away. Some might have allowed bitterness to take over. But Winkler found another path. He moved into producing. He explored work behind the camera. He accepted different kinds of roles. And slowly, over time, he rebuilt his identity. This second chapter of his career is especially important because it proved that Henry Winkler was much more than the Fonz. He was a producer, a director, an author, a performer, and eventually, one of the most respected older actors working in television. Then came another remarkable chapter: Barry. The HBO series gave Winkler an opportunity to play Gene Cousineau, a character dramatically different from the cheerful image many people still associated with him. The role reminded audiences that the man who had played Fonzie decades earlier still had enormous dramatic range. His performance earned him a Primetime Emmy Award, and there was something almost poetic about it. The actor who had once been told he was not living up to his potential was standing on one of television's biggest stages decades later, receiving one of the industry's highest honors. But Henry Winkler's story is not simply a story about winning. It is a story about continuing. Continuing after rejection. Continuing after embarrassment. Continuing after self-doubt. Continuing after being misunderstood. And continuing even when success itself created new problems. That is why the title "Heartbreaking News for Henry Winkler" should not be used to suggest something that has not been verified. There is no reason to invent a tragedy. The real story is already powerful enough. At 80, Winkler is living with the memories of an entire lifetime. He has experienced extraordinary success, but he also remembers what it felt like to be the child who could not understand why school was so difficult. He remembers the fear. He remembers the embarrassment. He remembers the feeling of trying and still failing. And perhaps that is why his work with children has become so meaningful. He knows exactly what it feels like to believe that your dream is impossible. He knows what it feels like to have other people decide who you are before you have the opportunity to discover yourself. And he knows what it feels like to finally realize that the thing you thought was your weakness may actually be part of what made you unique. His life also demonstrates something else. Success does not always arrive when we expect it. Sometimes it arrives decades later. Sometimes the role you thought would define you becomes only the beginning. Sometimes the biggest achievement comes after the world has already decided your best years are behind you. And sometimes the person who once struggled to read becomes an author whose books encourage millions of children. That transformation is extraordinary. But there is still an emotional question at the center of Henry Winkler's life. What would the younger Henry think if he could meet the 80-year-old Henry today? Would he believe that the actor who was once called lazy would become a celebrated performer? Would he believe that the boy who struggled to read would become a writer? Would he believe that the man who spent years feeling inadequate would one day become a source of encouragement for children facing exactly the same struggle? Probably not. And that may be the most heartbreaking and beautiful part of all. The young Henry did not need to become someone else. He needed someone to understand who he already was. Today, Winkler's career continues to evolve. As recently as 2026, he has continued to speak publicly about his Happy Days experiences and his long career, including appearances where he reflected on the culture of the show's set and his relationships with longtime colleagues. That matters because it shows that Henry Winkler is not simply living in the past. He continues to work. He continues to tell stories. He continues to connect with audiences. And he continues to find humor in a life that was not always easy. There is also something deeply moving about seeing him talk about the people who helped him along the way. Success rarely belongs to one person alone. Winkler has repeatedly expressed gratitude toward colleagues, friends, family members, and people who gave him opportunities when he needed them. And perhaps that gratitude comes from knowing exactly what it feels like to be rejected. When someone has spent years wondering whether they belong, being welcomed can mean everything. That is one reason the story of Henry Winkler continues to resonate so strongly. It is not really about Fonzie. It is not really about television ratings. It is not even about awards. It is about a human being who spent much of his childhood believing that he was failing, only to discover that he had been measuring himself by the wrong standards. And that lesson remains important. Because somewhere today, there is another child who believes they are stupid because reading is difficult. There is another student who studies all night and still cannot remember what they learned. There is another person who looks around and wonders why everyone else seems to understand something that they cannot. Henry Winkler's life tells that person something important. Difficulty does not mean impossibility. Being different does not mean being less. And struggling in one area does not determine the value of an entire human being. The heartbreaking part of Henry Winkler's story is that he had to spend so many years learning that lesson. The inspiring part is that he eventually learned it. And instead of keeping that knowledge to himself, he turned around and shared it with others. That may ultimately be his greatest achievement. Not Fonzie, not the awards, not the fame, not even the decades-long career. It may be the fact that a man who once felt misunderstood became someone determined to make other people feel understood. So when we look at Henry Winkler today, we should remember more than the leather jacket and the famous thumbs up. We should remember the frightened student, the struggling actor, the rejected performer, the man who discovered his dyslexia later in life, the actor who had to rebuild his career after becoming trapped by his own success, the author who turned personal pain into stories for children, and the performer who proved that reinvention is possible at almost any stage of life. Henry Winkler's story is heartbreaking because so much of his suffering could not be seen from the outside. But it is also hopeful because the ending has never been about suffering alone. It has been about what he chose to do with it. He could have allowed the criticism of his childhood to become his identity. Instead, he built a career. He could have allowed typecasting to end his ambitions. Instead, he reinvented himself. He could have hidden his dyslexia. Instead, he talked about it publicly and used his experience to help children. And he could have looked at aging as the end of his story. Instead, he continues to work, speak, create, and connect with audiences. So perhaps the real news about Henry Winkler is not that a tragedy has suddenly taken everything away. It is that after 8 decades of life, the man behind one of television's most famous characters still has a story worth hearing. A story filled with pain. A story filled with rejection. A story filled with uncertainty. But also a story filled with resilience. And maybe that is what makes Henry Winkler's life so unforgettable. The Fonz taught audiences to be confident. Henry Winkler taught them something much deeper. Sometimes confidence does not come first. Sometimes you move forward while you're still afraid. Sometimes you keep going even when you believe you are failing. Sometimes you discover your greatest strength only after spending years believing it was a weakness. And sometimes the most heartbreaking chapters of your life become the very chapters that allow you to help someone else. That is the legacy Henry Winkler continues to build, not simply as the Fonz, but as Henry, a man who struggled, a man who fell, a man who doubted himself, a man who kept going. And after all these years, a man who has shown millions of people that your hardest beginning does not have to determine your ending. If Henry Winkler's journey teaches us anything, it is this. Never let someone else's misunderstanding become your definition of yourself. Because sometimes, the person everyone thinks is falling behind is actually taking a completely different road towards something extraordinary. And Henry Winkler has spent a lifetime proving exactly that.